Between 1932 and 1933, millions of people in Ukraine did not have enough food, and the government was trying to hide it. It would take a brave journalist to uncover the truth. For many years, his work would be questioned and then forgotten. But today, this young journalist is remembered as a hero. His name is Gareth Jones. As a boy, Jones had listened to his mother's stories about her time in Ukraine. Ukraine had always been somewhere he longed to visit. Jones and his family were from Wales, a country that is part of the United Kingdom. In schools, he studied languages and became fluent in Russian as well as German and French. After school, Jones dreamed of becoming a journalist. Then he could travel the world and talk to people about their lives. He wanted a life of adventure. Jones had many adventures during his short life, and today you will learn about one of his most important ones, his dangerous adventure through Ukraine during the Great Famine. This is the story of Gareth Jones, the reporter who risked his life to find the truth.
Historians, welcome to another episode of Anytime Now. I'm Brooke, co-founder of Honest History. Today, we have a fascinating story about a man who was willing to risk his life for something he knew was right. Thankfully, most people are not put in this situation during the course of their lives, but Gareth Jones knew his sacrifice could help save countless lives. As you listen to this episode, think of what you would do in Jones's situation. Would you act differently, or would you follow in his footsteps? And most importantly, think of how the Ukrainian people felt, finally getting to tell the truth about what was going on in Ukraine. Now, let's journey back in time and get back to the story.
Our story begins in 1933. The train chugged along the tracks as the young journalist Gareth Jones looked out the window. It was March, and it was still freezing outside. The moon shone down on the snowy ground all around the train tracks. Jones was on a night train to Kharkiv, Ukraine. It was a long journey. He had left Moscow the day before and was supposed to visit a newly built tractor factory in Kharkiv. The Soviet press department was waiting for him there. But Jones had another idea. The train came to a slow stop. Jones looked around. They were in a small town, about 70 kilometers from Kharkiv. Quietly, he got up from his seat and walked towards the door. He looked around to make sure that no one was watching and quickly stepped off the train. Under the light of the stars, Jones tramped through the snow of the Ukrainian countryside. He was on a mission to discover the truth. At that time, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was made up of 15 different countries, including Russia and Ukraine. And in 1933, it was governed by the Communist Party and its leader, Joseph Stalin. Jones had been studying Stalin's plan, especially his 5-year plan. Part of this plan was to industrialize the Soviet Union. To do this, the government built factories, dams, railways, and canals. Another part of Stalin's plan was to collectivize farming. This meant that wealthy farmers no longer owned the land or livestock. Instead, all of the land and animals would be controlled by the government. Stalin argued that this would make farms more productive. The government could provide farms with the newest machinery that average farmers wouldn't be able to buy. Ukraine became an important place to collectivize farming. It has very rich, fertile land. Stalin said that the farms in Ukraine would produce enough food to feed all of the new factory workers. Enough food that the Soviet Union would sell grain to other countries. But Jones had a hunch that it wasn't true. In fact, he was almost certain that people were running out of food. Here's the thing. The newspaper kept saying that the Soviet Union was doing well, that it was a paradise. Jones had done a lot of research on Stalin's plan. It seemed to him that the peasant farmers living in the countryside didn't have enough to eat. The first time he visited the Soviet Union, he realized he might be right.
Russia is in a very bad state. Rotten, no food, only bread, oppression, injustice, misery among the workers,
Jones had written to his parents. At that time, journalists used the term Russia to talk about the entire Soviet Union, including Ukraine. Jones published 4 articles about the Soviet Union, trying to warn people about the food shortages. But other journalists criticized this article, saying that he was wrong.
There is no famine or actual starvation, nor is there likely to be,
one well-known journalist said. Why did no one believe Jones? It was clear to him that the people were starving. Why did no one want to talk about it? Was the Soviet Union trying to cover it up? The only way to get a real answer was to talk to the Ukrainian people, and that is exactly what he was going to do. The trouble was, it had become very difficult to get in and out of Ukraine. Foreign journalists weren't allowed to go there. Many Ukrainians weren't allowed to leave. The police were always watching, making sure they stayed near their home villages. But Jones was lucky. Unlike other foreigners, he had a special travel document because he worked for the UK government. He was allowed to pass through Ukraine without an escort. No one was watching him, making sure that he was up to any funny business. But still, it was very dangerous. If Jones was caught, he could be deported or thrown into prison. After Jones stepped off the night train, he began walking through the countryside. He saw a light in the distance coming from a small hut. He knocked on the door and asked to stay the night. For 3 days, Jones walked over 40 miles, visited many villages, and slept in farmers' homes. He talked to people along the way, trying to understand what was really going on.
Many are dying. We are starving. There is little cattle left. They take all grain away,
one woman told Jones. In that village, there used to be 200 oxen. Now, there were only 6.
They took away my grain,
another man said. Jones pulled out his notebook and began to write down everything they told him.
Hi, young historians. Time for a quick break from this amazing story to tell you a bit more about Honest History. If you're enjoying this episode, then you'll love Honest History's magazines and books. Each one is filled with important adventures through the past, like the story of Cheng Yi Sao, a Chinese woman who commanded one of the largest pirate fleets in history, to Mansa Musa from Africa, one of the wealthiest people to ever live. You can pick up a copy or subscribe and receive 3 issues delivered straight to your doorstep every 3 months. Just go to honesthistory.co and use code ANYTIMENOW for a 10% discount. That's honesthistory.co and special promo code ANYTIMENOW. Okay, let's get back to the story.
He spotted a woman tramping through the snow carrying empty sacks. They were walking towards Moscow.
It is terrible. We have no bread. We have to go all the way to Moscow to get bread, and then they will only give us 4 pounds, which costs 3 rubles. How can a poor man live?
They said. Jones heard that one woman stole 5 beets and was sent to prison for 10 years.
Have you any potatoes?
Jones asked. Everyone he met shook their heads.
What about your cows?
The cattle have nearly all died. How can we feed cattle when we have only fodder to eat ourselves?
They said. These horses were used to plow the fields, and without them, there would be no harvest. Many Ukrainians were angry. Some thought of revolting. For them, life in the Soviet Union was not paradise. It was the opposite. Every village that Jones visited, people warned him not to travel alone at night.
There are too many starving, desperate men,
soldiers told him. Jones wrote all of this down in his notebook. Across the countryside, he heard the same story over and over again.
There is no bread. We are dying.
People in the UK had no idea. People in Russian cities like Moscow probably didn't even know how bad it was. After 3 days, Jones knew that he needed to get back on the train. If he was gone too long, people might get suspicious. After his 3-day trip, Jones stepped aboard the train and headed to Kharkiv, Ukraine. He arrived at the tractor factory, and thankfully, no one seemed to notice that he disappeared. Jones carried on as usual, keeping his trip a secret. 18 days later, Jones boarded a train to Berlin. He was leaving the Soviet Union, and once Jones arrived in Berlin, he felt it was safe to describe what he saw.
I have just arrived from Russia, where I found the situation disastrous,
he wrote in a letter to England. Jones wanted to make his thoughts public. He decided to organize a press conference in Berlin. He gathered journalists who were living there and began telling them what he saw.
Millions are dying of hunger,
he told the journalists. This news shocked them. It went against everything that they had heard from the Soviet Union. That day, papers were already printing news.
Famine grips Russia. Millions dying,
one newspaper reported. News of the famine spread quickly to England and the United States. By now, Jones had already been planning to write the article on his own. He took out his notebook and flipped through many pages of notes. After hours of writing, his article was ready. On March 31st, 1933, Jones' story was printed in the London newspaper Evening Standard. It was titled, "Famine Rules Russia." In it, he described everything that he saw and heard from the Ukrainian people. Finally, the truth was out. Jones excitedly wrote home to his parents.
The New York Times, the Associated Press, the Allied newspapers, the Press Association all wanted interviews.
His article was getting a lot of attention, just as he hoped. But on that same day, another newspaper was published in the New York Times. It was written by another English journalist, Walter Duranty. The title of this article was,
"Russians hungry, but not starving."
Duranty argued that there was no famine in the Soviet Union. He said that Jones got everything wrong.
Jones's article is a big, scary story,
Duranty wrote. Duranty was older and had worked with the New York Times for years. Many trusted his words. Jones had revealed the truth, but now few listened. Jones' honest reporting was questioned for the rest of his career, and sadly, his career was not long. In 1935, just 2 years after he visited Ukraine, Jones was mysteriously murdered. Today, some people think that he was killed by the Soviet Union's secret police, but we may never know for sure. Jones knew that his article could get him in trouble, and that was a risk he was willing to take. For almost 50 years, the Soviet Union did not speak about the famine. And for almost 60 years, Jones' article was ignored. It took a long time for people to recognize Jones's work. In 2001, his niece wrote a book about her uncle. Since then, Jones became known around the world. Books, articles, even Hollywood movies have been created about his life. It also took people a very long time to recognize what the Soviet Union had done to the Ukrainian people. In Ukraine, the famine is known as Holodomor. In Ukrainian, Holodomor means to kill by hunger. Under the Soviet Union, millions died because they did not have food. Today, Gareth Jones is remembered in Ukraine as a national hero. He did what no other journalist would do at the time. He spoke to the Ukrainian people and risked his life to tell the truth.
Welcome back. This story is an important one because it gives an example of one of the many reasons for tensions that exist between Ukraine and Russia. You may have heard about the war going on in Ukraine, and while war is always terrifying, it's amazing to see the Ukrainian people stand together so their voices may be heard. That's why the study of history is so important. It reminds us what happened to our ancestors and acts as a reminder of why it's important to not let bad moments from history repeat themselves. That's all for now, but if you want to learn more about exciting and important stories from history, be sure to check out Honest History magazine. You can learn all about the Maya, the Ottoman Empire, female pirates, and more. See you all next time. This episode was hosted by Joe Dombrowski and written by Heidi Coburn. Production was led by Randall Lawrence. To learn more about this episode, including more about the host, visit us at honesthistory.co and follow along for updates on social media at Honest History.
When you think about history, are there lots of old guys wearing wigs and stockings? When you think about history, is Napoleon really short? And folks have wooden teeth. Do you know that history can be the most incredible, amazing stories for you and me? Sit back and listen to a story right now. It's honest, it's fun, and it's sure to